Aldous Leonard Huxley grew up in rooms where ideas were treated as furniture, not displayed, not admired, used. At Laleham, the family home in Surrey, books lay open on chairs, journals were left face down on tables, and conversation moved easily from biology to literature to ethics. A visitor might notice a copy of Nature resting beside a half-finished cup of tea, its ring already drying into the wood. Papers were stacked loosely, sometimes moved, sometimes not. No one hurried to put things away. Reading was not scheduled. It happened when someone reached for a page and stopped speaking. Nothing in this environment suggested rebellion. Nothing suggested danger. Nothing suggested urgency. It was the kind of childhood designed to produce confidence, the kind that assumes the world is legible if you are educated enough to read it. This matters, because what Aldous Huxley would later notice cannot be explained by anger or exclusion. He was not pushed aside. He was not denied access. He was raised inside comfort, and even then, something quiet was already taking shape. Comfort, once organized at scale, does not retreat. It only becomes smoother, more efficient, less noticeable. No generation votes to become less comfortable than the one before it. No society dismantles ease once it has learned how to produce it reliably. As a boy, his days followed predictable rhythms. A bell in the morning. Shoes aligned beneath beds. Beds made quickly, without conversation. Bodies forming rows without instruction. Chapel came first. Boys stood shoulder to shoulder, hands still, eyes forward. Silence held not by threat, but by expectation. The service ended on time. The benches emptied in order. The aisle cleared without delay. Breakfast followed immediately. Plates placed in front of them. Cutlery lifted together. Conversation stayed low and brief. A second bell ended the meal, whether it felt finished or not. Lessons filled the morning, one room after another. Desks heavy, polished smooth by decades of hands resting in the same places. Exercise books opened to the correct page without prompting. A confident answer moved the lesson forward. A hesitant one slowed it down. Midday repeated the pattern. Another bell. Another room. Another meal taken at pace. Chairs pushed in. Bodies redirected. Time measured precisely enough that no one needed to look at a clock. Afternoon study brought quiet again. Chairs drawn in. Backs straightened. Pages turned at roughly the same moments. Pens paused together. Even mistakes followed familiar shapes. Evening closed the loop. Lamps dimmed at the same hour. Study ended without announcement. Beds taken in sequence. The day ended as it had begun, without interruption. The next morning arrived unchanged. The bell rang again. rows formed again. Silence returned again. Breakfast tasted the same. Lessons occupied the same rooms. The same desks bore the same marks. The same windows admitted the same light. Even the dust settled in familiar patterns. Midday arrived on schedule. Plates cleared, chairs pushed in, bodies redirected again. No one asked what came next. Evening followed. Study resumed. Lamps dimmed. Sleep arrived because it was time for sleep to arrive. The routine repeated, and then repeated again. Days passed. Weeks passed. Terms passed. At Eton, the timetable did most of the governing. Authority rarely needed to speak. Everyone already knew where to be, when to arrive, and how long to remain. Certainty moved things along. Hesitation delayed them. No one explained this. No one needed to. Most of the boys around Huxley absorbed it easily. They moved forward without friction, stepping into the roles expected of them as if those roles had always been waiting just ahead. Huxley watched this process, not critically, not suspiciously, simply watching. Then his body intervened. At 16, an illness attacked his eyes with sudden violence. The world blurred. Light became painful. Reading, the one activity that had anchored his inner life, became almost impossible. Morning still arrived, but the routine did not resume. Curtains were drawn earlier than before. Light was filtered through cloth. Voices lowered. Instructions replaced schedules. Days passed without improvement. Then weeks. Books were lifted from his hands and set aside. Letters were read aloud to him. Pages were closed gently, then taken away. He listened where he had once read. He waited where he had once advanced. There were attempts to return to normal. A short reading session at a desk by the window. A walk outside in daylight. Both ended quickly. Pain arrived before comprehension did. Another attempt followed days later. Then another. After that, each ended the same way. Time stretched. Then stretched again. Doctors spoke carefully. Not urgently. Not conclusively. Adults adjusted their expectations downward. Lessons were postponed. Plans revised. Progress redefined. Conversations shortened. Questions were answered, cautiously. Huxley adapted without protest. He waited when told to wait. Stopped when told to stop. Resumed only when permitted. Time became something administered rather than used. Normality did not return. It receded. When partial vision returned, it came with conditions. Bright light caused pain. Long periods of reading demanded recovery. Every intellectual effort carried a physical cost. What had once been automatic now required pacing. The limitation did not dramatize him. It slowed him. While others rushed forward into the modern world, Huxley learned how to remain still inside it. That stillness changed what he noticed. The world around him was accelerating. Factory whistles divided the day beyond school grounds. Trains arrived and departed by posted times. Platforms filled and emptied in sequence. Conductors called destinations without urgency. People queued without instruction. Timetables were mounted on walls large enough to read at a distance. Arrows indicated where to stand. Notices explained. Delays before anyone asked. People shifted their weight, checked watches, and waited. Stations moved people through space with minimal conversation. Lines formed naturally. Gaps closed automatically. Movement resumed when signaled. Signage appeared everywhere. Hours. Rules. Directions. Notices affixed to walls, repeated often enough to become background. Posters offered soap, cigarettes, rail services. Simple promises. Clear lettering. No explanation required. Persuasion no longer waited for conversation. It occupied space. People responded automatically. They stepped aside, waited where indicated, boarded when told, moved when the line advanced, stopped when it did not. Human attention was becoming measurable. Human desire was becoming manageable. Most people experienced this as convenience. Huxley experienced it as a pattern. He noticed how easily discomfort was framed as a problem to be solved, how quickly patience was labeled inefficiency, how rarely anyone was expected to endure anything for long. No one protested this shift. No one demanded difficulty back. The systems enabling it did not ask for belief. They did not demand loyalty. They only required participation. But because observation is about to turn into description, and description into vision, a person arrived when instructed, stood where marked, waited for the signal, moved forward, paused when required, accepted the printed assurance, proceeded. By the time Huxley began to write seriously, he was no longer interested in villains. He was interested in incentives, in what a world quietly rewards and what it slowly forgets. He paid attention to what advanced smoothly and what stalled, to what was encouraged without being spoken aloud, to which behaviors disappeared simply because they took too long. A society does not need to forbid thought if it can crowd it. It does not need to punish dissent if it can exhaust it. The pace itself did the work. Huxley did not imagine people marching into chains. He imagined something simpler. People settling. Settling for comfort. Settling for distraction. Settling for a life where nothing is asked of them except that they remain satisfied. The appeal was obvious. Satisfaction required no argument. It offered relief without explanation. It reduced friction without demanding reflection. What unsettled him was not pleasure, but dependence on it, the way unease began to feel intolerable, the way waiting was treated as error, the way silence came to seem like absence instead of space. None of this arrived as crisis. It arrived as normality. Trains ran on time. Schedules held. Queues advanced. Posters faded and were replaced. Life functioned, and because it functioned, it was trusted. This realization did not arrive as outrage. It arrived as clarity. It did not demand response. It demanded attention. The child who had learned to wait quietly in classrooms, to stand in rows, to follow bells without resentment, now recognized the same logic at work on a larger scale. Order without coercion, compliance without force, direction without command. This was not a theory yet. It was an accumulation, enough observations aligned to suggest a direction, enough patterns repeated to feel structural rather than accidental. And that was enough. Enough to change the direction of his work. Enough to carry him forward into ideas that would later be misunderstood as prophecy. This is where this part of the story pauses. Not because the thought is finished. Before we continue, take a quiet moment. If you're listening from somewhere in the world right now, feel free to let us know in the comments where you are, and what time it is for you as this story reaches you. Some people listen late at night, others while working, traveling, or trying to slow their thoughts. There's no right moment for a story like this, only the one you happen to be in. And if this kind of long-form history helps you stay with the night, consider subscribing so you can find your way back again. Now, let's go back to the beginning. By the time Aldous Huxley entered adulthood, the world around him had begun to speak with a different kind of confidence. Language no longer lingered. It moved. It directed. It resolved situations quickly enough that few people noticed the resolution had happened. Words appeared in public spaces not to invite reflection, but to organize behavior. On station walls, in newspapers designed for scanning, in notices meant to be understood instantly and discarded just as quickly, language had become practical. It told people where to stand, when to move, what to expect. Huxley noticed this not with suspicion, but with attention. He listened to how explanations shortened into statements, and how statements survived because they were easy to repeat. The world did not argue its way forward. It repeated itself forward. This repetition felt helpful. Clear language reduced confusion. Short messages saved time. Certainty smoothed interaction. People appreciated being told what was happening without needing to ask. Direction came to feel like courtesy rather than authority. Huxley's early writing took shape inside this atmosphere. He reviewed books, wrote essays, contributed commentary that circulated comfortably among educated audiences. His tone was measured. his language precise. Nothing he published suggested disruption or urgency. He was not yet trying to warn anyone. He was learning how language behaved once it left private thought and entered public circulation. He observed how ideas changed as they spread. Complexity thinned. What remained was what could travel easily between people. The more an idea circulated, the less explanation it required. Familiarity replaced understanding, and this substitution went largely unnoticed. Institutions adapted quickly. Schools emphasized clarity. Journalism favored decisiveness. Advertising refined suggestion without argument. Messages grew smoother, quieter, more confident. They did not demand attention. They assumed it. Huxley did not stand outside this shift. He participated in it. He lectured. He published. He spoke to audiences who believed language could improve society. For a time, that belief seemed justified. Systems appeared responsive. Problems felt manageable. Solutions arrived with reassuring speed. Yet he began to notice a subtle imbalance. Answers often appeared before questions were fully formed. Conclusions arrived before reflection had time to settle. Language moved directly toward resolution, bypassing uncertainty, as if uncertainty itself were a fault rather than a condition of thought. Tone began to matter more than content. Calm phrasing soothed anxiety. Assured statements reduced doubt. Repetition created familiarity. Familiarity created trust. This was not deception in any dramatic sense. No one felt misled. The process was too gentle for that. People felt guided, relieved of the burden of thinking things through completely. Huxley began to understand that persuasion did not need intensity. It needed consistency. A message repeated often enough did not feel imposed. It felt ambient, like part of the environment rather than an argument introduced into it. As he moved between cities, lectures, and social circles, he heard the same phrases reshaped for different audiences, shortened, polished, made portable. Language was becoming modular. It could be removed from context and still function. This modularity reduced friction. Disagreement slowed conversation. Reflection delayed action. Uncertainty complicated coordination. Simplified language solved all three. The world rewarded this efficiency quietly. Those who spoke clearly advanced. Those who hesitated were bypassed. Those who complicated matters were ignored without confrontation. The pattern extended beyond speech. Institutions reorganized around predictability. Schedules tightened. Procedures standardized. Outcomes were measured more carefully than intentions. People adapted without complaint, learning which tones were welcome and which questions delayed progress. Aldous Huxley did not interpret this as oppression. He saw it as optimization. Optimization spread easily because it solved immediate problems. It made coordination smoother. It made participation easier. Once accepted, it required no enforcement. He noticed how people adjusted themselves before being corrected. They shortened their thoughts before expressing them. They avoided questions that would slow the room. Efficiency became a social instinct rather than an imposed rule. The cost of reflection shifted. It was no longer political. It was social. To hesitate was to interrupt momentum. To pause was to require justification. Huxley carried these observations without organizing them. They accumulated quietly, not as a theory, but as pressure. Language shaping behavior. Behavior shaping expectation. Expectation narrowing what felt reasonable to say. By the early decades of the 20th century, he sensed that the world was tightening in a way few people could name, not through force, not through command, but through habits that made certain ways of thinking feel unnecessary. The machinery was not complete, but it was already closing. As these patterns settled into everyday life, Huxley became increasingly aware of how little resistance they met. People did not need to be persuaded. They adjusted. They learned what worked by watching what moved smoothly and what stalled. The pace of interaction did much of the teaching. Conversations advanced when agreement arrived quickly. They slowed when uncertainty appeared. Over time, hesitation acquired a cost. Not a formal one, but a social one. To hesitate was to interrupt flow. Explanation itself began to feel heavy. Long reasoning demanded attention. Attention required time. Time was increasingly scarce. In its place came affirmation and forward motion. Thought that could not be compressed was postponed or quietly abandoned. Huxley watched this dynamic shape group behavior. Meetings concluded more efficiently when consensus formed early. Dissent extended discussion and was therefore avoided. Fewer people voiced uncertainty, not because doubt disappeared, but because it delayed progress. This shift required no authority. No one enforced it. It emerged from preference. People preferred smooth interactions to difficult ones. They preferred reassurance to ambiguity. They preferred momentum to pause. The environment rewarded those preferences consistently. Language reinforced this reward system. Statements promised stability. Phrases implied continuity. Words suggested that systems were under control. Precision mattered less than reassurance. What counted was reducing unease quickly. As political tension increased across Europe, these tendencies intensified. Public speech grew louder, yet narrower. Positions hardened. Slogans multiplied. nuance faded. People aligned rapidly, often without examining why. Urgency discouraged hesitation. Reflection felt like delay. Huxley did not confuse noise with depth. He observed how fear and reassurance alternated in public messaging. One heightened attention, the other soothed it. Together, they guided behavior efficiently, leaving little room for independent evaluation. What unsettled him was not propaganda itself, but its reception. People did not merely accept simplified narratives. They welcomed them. Simplification reduced effort. It made the world feel manageable again. In uncertain times, manageability carried its own appeal. He began to suspect that future societies would not suppress dissent through force. They would outpace it. Conversations would move forward before objections could fully form. Dissent would be left behind, not silenced, but bypassed. Speed began to function as a filter. Those who questioned slowly did not keep up. Those who paused were overtaken. The discussion moved on without them. Huxley noticed how rarely people were compelled to comply. They volunteered. They adapted. They internalized expectations because doing so made life easier. Compliance did not feel like surrender. It felt practical. He understood that this form of control depended not on obedience, but on habit. Habits shaped preference. Preference shaped participation. Participation reproduced the system without oversight. No villains were required. No conspiracy was necessary. Only incentives aligned toward ease, efficiency, and continuity. Over time, these incentives shaped behavior more reliably than rules or punishment ever could. Huxley carried this understanding quietly. He did not yet shape it into doctrine. He allowed it to accumulate, observation by observation, until the pattern felt undeniable. The world was not being forced into submission. It was being eased into alignment. People were not threatened. They were accommodated. And accommodation, once normalized, became expectation. By now, Aldous Huxley sensed that continuing to observe was no longer enough. The patterns he saw could not be explained through analysis alone. Argument would provoke defense. Direct warning would be dismissed as exaggeration. Something else was required. Not explanation, but distance. Distance enough to make the familiar visible. Distance enough to compress what was spreading slowly into something that could be seen all at once. This need pushed him toward imagination. By the time this pressure became impossible to ignore, Huxley no longer experienced it as a series of observations. It felt continuous, embedded, present beneath ordinary interaction, shaping what moved easily and what stalled. What struck him most was how rarely anyone named the process. People described outcomes, not mechanisms. They spoke about efficiency, coordination, improvement. They did not speak about what had been displaced to make those things possible. He noticed how quickly environments taught behavior without instruction. A room arranged for speed discouraged pause. A schedule designed for throughput discouraged reflection. Over time, people adjusted without realizing they were adjusting. They learned what the room required by watching what survived it. This learning felt natural. No one experienced it as loss. The changes arrived gradually, layered into routine. Each adjustment made the next one easier to accept. Huxley paid attention to what disappeared quietly. Long pauses. Open-ended questions. Conversations without clear outcomes. These did not vanish because they were forbidden. They vanished because they did not fit. The room moved faster without them. He saw how responsibility dissolved into systems. Decisions were framed as procedural rather than moral. Outcomes appeared inevitable rather than chosen. When something went wrong, it was attributed to process failure, not intention. This diffusion of responsibility made critique difficult. If no one was responsible, no one could be confronted. The machinery of daily life insulated itself through complexity and speed. Huxley understood that this was not cruelty. It was convenience. Systems optimized for comfort rarely noticed what they excluded. They responded to feedback only when friction became visible. Until then, they continued, people adapted accordingly. They anticipated expectations. They shaped themselves to fit. Over time, this self-shaping felt like identity rather than accommodation. Participation became the default proof of belonging. Opting out did not feel dangerous. It felt strange. Strangeness carried its own cost. It required explanation. It invited questions. Participation required nothing at all. Huxley noticed how rarely people practiced refusal. Not dramatic refusal, but simple hesitation. Saying no introduced friction. Saying yes preserved flow. Over time, yes became automatic. Pleasure reinforced this automation. Enjoyment softened scrutiny. Satisfaction replaced inquiry. The more pleasant an experience, the less it was examined. Huxley did not see pleasure as the problem. He saw substitution at work. Pleasure standing in for meaning. Ease standing in for choice. Satisfaction standing in for freedom. These substitutions accumulated quietly. No announcement marked the transition. The change was distributed across countless small accommodations. What concerned him was how difficult this order would be to oppose. It did not threaten. It did not punish. It offered relief, and relief, when reliable, trained preference. People did not feel controlled. They felt supported. Support, delivered consistently, became dependency. Huxley realized that argument would fail here. Critique would be misunderstood. Warning would provoke dismissal. The very mechanisms he observed would neutralize direct opposition. The environment he was describing did not respond to confrontation. It absorbed it. What was required was not explanation, but perspective. Distance enough to see patterns whole, rather than fragment by fragment. Distance enough to allow recognition without accusation. Distance enough for readers to encounter themselves without feeling targeted. This was not yet creation. It was necessity. Aldous Huxley understood that continuing to analyze the present would only reproduce its limits. The language available to him was already shaped by the systems he was observing. To describe them faithfully, he would need to step outside their immediate logic. Imagination offered that step, not as escape, as compression, a way to gather scattered tendencies into a single form, a way to exaggerate gently without distorting, a way to make the familiar visible by displacing it slightly. He did not seek prediction. He sought clarity. The world he would later describe was already rehearsing itself. The language existed. The incentives were aligned. The behaviors were normalized. The machinery was in motion. Huxley did not turn to imagination because he wanted to escape the world. He turned to it because the world had become too smooth to describe directly. The language available to him was already shaped by the forces he had been watching. Public speech preferred reassurance. Argument triggered defense. Critique was absorbed and neutralized by the very systems it tried to confront. To say something plainly was to be misunderstood plainly. So he looked for a form that could hold pressure without announcing itself as pressure. Fiction offered that, not as fantasy, but as distance. Distance enough to show a pattern without accusing the reader of participating in it. Distance enough to let recognition arrive on its own, without the listener being forced to admit anything out loud. This was not a sudden decision. It was an accumulation reaching its limit. Huxley had spent years observing how language moved through a room and changed the room by moving through it. He had watched how people adapted themselves to convenience without being asked. He had watched how certainty became a form of comfort, how complexity was treated as a delay. Now he wanted to take those tendencies and compress them, not into a lecture, into a world. He began to imagine what would happen if the mechanisms he had noticed were simply allowed to complete themselves. If coordination became the highest virtue, if discomfort was treated as error, if stability was valued more than truth, he did not have to invent a villain. That was the point. The world he was describing did not require malice. It required preference. If people preferred the easy path, the system could rely on them. If people preferred reassurance, the system could feed them. If people preferred not to feel conflicted, the system could remove conflict from their experience. Huxley understood that control, in such a world, would not look like control. It would look like care. It would arrive as public health, as efficiency, as gentleness. The reader would not be asked to imagine brutality. They would be asked to imagine comfort that goes too far. This was the risk. A story like this could be dismissed as exaggeration. It could be treated as satire. It could be flattened into entertainment. So he needed to keep the tone steady. Not hysterical. Not moral. Precise. He began with a premise that felt simple. What if human beings could be organized so well that they no longer needed to struggle? Not struggle against poverty. Not struggle against illness. Not struggle against illness. Not struggle against uncertainty. What if the hardest parts of life were removed early enough that people never developed the muscles required to endure them? And what if, in return for that removal, they gave up something they could not name? Huxley understood that the trade would not be presented as a trade. It would be presented as progress. The new world would not advertise its losses. It would advertise its benefits. It would tell people what it was doing for them, not what it was taking away. And because it was doing something for them, the taking would be harder to notice. He began to sketch institutions that would make this possible, not in technical detail, but in social logic. A place where individuals were produced rather than raised. A place where identity was shaped early enough to feel natural. A place where language was simplified so that fewer inner conflicts could form. Not through censorship, but through design. He knew that coercion would make the story too easy. If people were punished, the reader could stand apart and say, "That is not me." So the world had to function without punishment. It had to be stable, orderly, satisfied. It had to feel like something people might choose. This is what made the idea unsettling. It did not accuse anyone of cruelty. It accused them of preference. And preference is difficult to defend against, because preference feels personal. It feels innocent. It feels like taste. Huxley understood that the most effective form of control is the one people do not experience as control. The world he was building would not demand belief. It would demand participation. It would not ask people to think. It would ask them to feel fine. This is where the work begins to shift from observation into construction. The pressure he had carried in silence becomes a setting. The habits he had watched become policy. The language he had studied becomes the air his characters breathe. He did not write it to predict the future. He wrote it to show a question that the present refused to ask. What happens when a society becomes so good at removing discomfort that it forgets what discomfort was for? Once Huxley had the shape of the world in mind, he became careful about what he left out. The future he was imagining could not feel dramatic. Drama would give the reader distance. If events were too extreme, they could be dismissed as fantasy. If suffering was too visible, the reader could reassure themselves that they would resist. So he designed a world where very little appeared wrong. Conflict existed, but it was managed early. Desire existed, but it was directed. Difference existed, but it was categorized and neutralized before it could harden into tension. The people in this world were not miserable. That was essential. Misery invites sympathy. Contentment invites complicity. Huxley paid close attention to how satisfaction might function as a stabilizer. If people were comfortable enough, they would not ask why they were comfortable. If their needs were met predictably, they would not develop the patience required to question the system meeting them. He understood that deprivation sharpens awareness. Its absence dulls it. So deprivation had to be removed methodically. The society he was constructing would not starve people. It would feed them efficiently. It would not deny pleasure. It would supply it in measured, repeatable forms. It would not forbid attachment. It would redirect it toward safe objects. This redirection mattered. Attachment is disruptive when it is unpredictable. It creates loyalties that cannot be scheduled. In Huxley's imagined world, attachment would be managed so that it never interfered with stability. He did not frame this as cruelty. He framed it as care. Care without intimacy. Care without risk. Care without obligation. The people in this world would grow up inside a system that worked too well to doubt. From their earliest moments, expectations would be shaped before reflection had time to develop. By the time questions could be asked, the answers would already feel obvious. This was not indoctrination in the traditional sense. There were no speeches, no slogans shouted in unison. Instead, there was repetition embedded in routine. Messages delivered so early and so often that they no longer registered as messages. Huxley understood that belief is strongest when it does not feel like belief. So the world had to train preference rather than demand agreement. People would not be told what to think. They would be placed in conditions where certain thoughts felt unnecessary, where alternatives felt impractical, where dissatisfaction felt like a personal malfunction rather than a signal. In this environment, language would not need to persuade. It would simply describe what already felt true. Words would confirm experience rather than challenge it. Huxley noticed that this approach mirrored the real world more closely than any overt tyranny could. Systems rarely announce themselves as systems. They present themselves as normality. So the imagined society would speak calmly. It would reassure constantly. It would avoid extremes. Extremes provoke reaction. Moderation dulls it. The people living inside it would not feel silenced. They would feel understood. And because they felt understood, they would not feel the need to speak. Huxley paid attention to what kind of resistance could survive in such a world. Open rebellion would look childish. Anger would seem inappropriate. Passion would feel inefficient. The only remaining form of resistance would be quiet discomfort, a sense that something was missing, without the language to describe what it was. This was the danger point. If that discomfort became articulate, the system would have to respond. So the system had to remain ahead of articulation. It had to offer relief before reflection. Huxley saw how easily this could be done. Discomfort could be labeled stress. Stress could be treated. Treatment could be pleasant. Relief could arrive without insight. In such a world, the question, "Why do I feel this way?" would be replaced by, "How can I stop feeling this?" This substitution was subtle, but decisive. It redirected attention inward, away from structure and toward self-management. If something felt wrong, the individual adjusted. The system remained unquestioned. Huxley understood that this was the most efficient form of stability. It required no enforcement. It relied on people managing themselves in accordance with expectations they did not experience as imposed. As he developed these ideas, he became more restrained in how he presented them. He did not explain every mechanism. He allowed them to operate quietly in the background. The reader would encounter a world that functioned smoothly, and only gradually realize what that smoothness cost. That realization, he believed, would land more deeply than any argument could. This was the discipline he imposed on himself as a writer. To show without insisting. To describe without accusing. To let the reader feel unease without telling them where it came from. The world was becoming clearer now, not as a warning, but as a mirror held at a slight angle. And in that angle, Huxley hoped recognition would begin. As the imagined world took on weight, Huxley became increasingly attentive to what it felt like from the inside, not what it promised. Not how it justified itself, but how it was lived. A society organized around comfort would not feel oppressive. That was the insight he kept returning to. Oppression announces itself. It provokes resistance by being obvious. The world he was constructing would do the opposite. It would feel benign, even generous. People would wake into routines that worked. Their days would unfold without sharp edges. Decisions would be made early, quietly, and consistently. Choice would exist, but it would be narrow enough to feel manageable. This narrowing was crucial. Too much choice produces anxiety. Too little produces resentment. but just enough produces relief. Huxley understood that relief is persuasive. When systems remove the burden of deciding, people rarely ask what has been decided for them. When uncertainty is eliminated before it becomes conscious, it is not experienced as loss. So the world had to anticipate desire, not suppress it, not punish it, but meet it before it hardened into something disruptive. In this imagined society, dissatisfaction would be treated as a signal to intervene early, not to inquire, not to explore meaning, to adjust conditions so that the discomfort dissolved. Huxley was careful here. He did not want the reader to see cruelty where there was none. The interventions would be pleasant, gentle, even welcomed. If something felt wrong, there would be a remedy. If someone felt uneasy, there would be relief. If questions arose, there would be answers that closed the question rather than deepened it. This is what made the world stable. It did not argue people out of their doubts. It prevented doubts from becoming articulate in the first place. Huxley saw how easily this mirrored the tendencies he had observed around him. The increasing emphasis on adjustment rather than understanding, on feeling better rather than knowing more, on solutions that addressed symptoms without touching causes. The imagined society did not need to lie. It simply needed to prioritize comfort over inquiry. Language in this world would reflect that priority. It would be clean, optimistic, free of tension. Words would not be used to open questions, but to close them. Speech would confirm experience rather than challenge it. Huxley understood that the danger here was subtle. A reader looking for obvious tyranny would miss it entirely. They would see a society functioning efficiently and wonder where the problem was supposed to be. That was the point. The problem was not what people suffered. It was what they no longer needed to endure. Endurance builds something invisible. Patience. Depth. The capacity to sit with uncertainty without immediately escaping it. Remove the need for endurance, and those capacities quietly atrophy. Huxley did not frame this as moral decline. He framed it as consequence. If a system removes friction everywhere, it also removes the conditions that produce resilience. If it eliminates discomfort at every turn, it eliminates the reasons people learn to interpret discomfort rather than flee from it. The imagined world would not collapse. It would persist. And persistence was the most unsettling possibility of all. A society that fails visibly invites reform. A society that functions smoothly while hollowing out certain human capacities does not. This was the thought that followed him as he wrote. He was not asking whether such a world would be pleasant. He assumed it would be. He was asking what kind of people would result from it. People who were calm, satisfied, well-adjusted, and people who no longer knew how to recognize what they had traded for that adjustment. Huxley resisted the urge to clarify this too much. He knew that explanation would weaken the effect. The reader needed to arrive at the unease themselves, without being told where to look. So, he focused on atmosphere, on small interactions, on a sense that everything worked slightly too well. The imagined society would not announce its values. It would embed them in routine, in language, in expectation. By the time a character noticed something was missing, they would lack the vocabulary to name it, and without language, recognition stalls. This was the quiet center of the book taking shape, not a warning shouted into the future, but a mirror held close to the present, close enough that the reader might recognize familiar habits reframed. Aldous Huxley did not believe he was inventing something new. He believed he was arranging what already existed into a form that could be seen all at once. The world he was writing was not inevitable, but it was plausible. And plausibility, he understood, is more disturbing than prophecy. Chapter 3 closes here. Not with instruction, but with form. The idea has taken shape. The world exists. What follows is not explanation, but encounter. The reader will not be told what to think. They will be asked to live inside it for a while, and notice what feels missing. The imagined world did not fail its people. That was the problem. What Huxley had built in his mind was not a nightmare that collapsed under its own weight. It was a system that endured precisely because it succeeded. People inside it lived long, orderly lives. They were healthy. They were occupied. They rarely experienced extremes of suffering. Nothing appeared broken. And yet something essential no longer had a place to form. Huxley began to focus less on institutions and more on the kind of human being this world quietly produced, not through force, but through repetition, through expectation, through early shaping that made alternatives feel unnatural rather than forbidden. In such a society, individuality would still exist. People would have preferences, personalities, tastes, but those traits would express themselves only within narrow, pre-approved ranges. Difference would be cosmetic rather than structural. This mattered more than it first appeared. When difference is limited to surface variation, it no longer challenges the system that contains it. It becomes decoration rather than resistance. Huxley understood that rebellion requires friction. It requires dissatisfaction that cannot be immediately resolved. It requires time spent with discomfort long enough for it to become articulate. In the world he was imagining, discomfort rarely survived that long. If something felt wrong, there were mechanisms to address it quickly. If someone felt restless, there were outlets. If a sense of emptiness appeared, it was treated as a condition to be managed. not a signal to be interpreted. Over time, people learned to distrust their unease. They learned to treat it as noise rather than information. This produced a subtle but profound shift. Inner conflict, once a source of growth, became a symptom. Questions that could not be answered quickly were seen as impractical. Depth itself began to feel inefficient. The result was not cruelty, but shallowness. Not stupidity, but narrowing. Huxley did not portray his characters as villains or fools. They were intelligent within the limits they had inherited. They were emotionally regulated. They were socially adjusted. They were also curiously weightless. Their lives moved forward without accumulation. Experiences happened, but they did not settle. Nothing lingered long enough to shape character through struggle. Memory existed, but it was softened, edited, stripped of sharp edges. Without friction, time lost texture. Days passed smoothly, but they did not deepen. Moments were pleasant, but they did not bind together into narrative. Life became a sequence of satisfactions rather than a story with tension. Huxley saw this as the quiet cost of perpetual ease. A life without strain may be comfortable, but it leaves little behind. It produces continuity without meaning, motion without direction. The people in this world did not feel trapped. They felt safe. Safety replaced aspiration. Stability replaced longing. And because longing was absent, the future no longer pulled at them. It arrived already decided, already arranged, already optimized. This was the most difficult part to communicate. A reader might ask, what exactly has been lost? Huxley resisted answering that directly. Naming it too clearly would turn it into a slogan. Instead, he let absence speak for itself. There were no heroes in this world, because heroism requires risk. There were no tragedies, because tragedy requires irreversible choice. There were no great works born of suffering, because suffering had been minimized before it could transform into creation. What remained was balance. Balance so complete that nothing tipped. Huxley understood that such a world would not provoke outrage. It would provoke confusion, followed by acceptance. People would not feel oppressed. They would feel complete. And completeness, when supplied externally, leaves little room for inner life to grow. This is where the human cost becomes visible, not in pain, but in quiet diminishment. The system had solved for happiness. It had not solved for meaning. Aldous Huxley did not present this as a verdict. He presented it as a condition. Once discomfort was managed before it could deepen, other human capacities began to thin as well. Love, in particular, changed shape. Huxley imagined relationships that were warm but light, intimate but temporary. Attachment existed, but it was regulated early, softened before it could harden into dependency or devotion. People connected easily and separated without damage. Bonds formed without demanding sacrifice. This made life smoother. It also made love smaller. In a world where suffering was minimized, love no longer needed to endure. It did not have to hold through conflict or survive uncertainty. It became another experience to be enjoyed rather than a commitment that reshaped the self. Jealousy was unnecessary. Loss was brief. Grief was treated efficiently. Emotional pain was addressed as imbalance rather than meaning. People learned to avoid depth, not because it was forbidden, but because it was inconvenient. The same narrowing occurred with creativity. Huxley did not imagine a culture without art. On the contrary, there was abundance. Entertainment was constant. Music, images, stories were readily available, pleasing, and safe. Creativity existed everywhere, but it rarely risked anything. Art no longer emerged from tension or longing. It emerged from technique, from repetition, from refinement of what had already proven acceptable. Nothing shocked, nothing disturbed, nothing lingered long enough to demand interpretation. Creation became production. Expression became output. The arts no longer asked questions. They offered atmosphere. This suited the society perfectly. Art that soothes does not interrupt. Art that entertains does not accuse. Art that reassures blends seamlessly into a system designed to maintain equilibrium. Huxley understood that this would not feel like decline to those living inside it. It would feel like cultural maturity, a world that had outgrown excess, a society that had learned to enjoy itself responsibly. What disappeared was not beauty, but risk. And risk, once removed, cannot be rediscovered easily. Loyalty changed as well. In the absence of hardship, allegiance shifted away from people and toward systems. Institutions became reliable in ways individuals could not match. They provided stability, comfort, continuity. People trusted them because they worked. Personal loyalty, by contrast, required tolerance for unpredictability. It demanded patience. It asked people to endure frustration without guarantee of reward. In this imagined world, that kind of loyalty felt inefficient. Why rely deeply on another person when the system would never fail you? Why endure conflict when relief was always available elsewhere? Over time, trust moved upward and outward. It attached itself to structures rather than relationships. People became less dependent on one another, not through isolation, but through substitution. The system filled the gaps that intimacy once occupied. This produced a curious loneliness that few recognized as loneliness. People were surrounded, connected, engaged. And yet, Something in their interior lives remained underdeveloped. Huxley did not dramatize this loneliness. He let it remain faint, barely perceptible, the kind that surfaces only in rare moments of quiet, before being smoothed away by routine. Silence itself became uncomfortable. Without struggle to anchor them, people floated gently through experience. They adapted easily. They adjusted quickly. They rarely felt lost, but they also rarely felt found. The absence of extremes made life easier to manage, but harder to remember. Nothing marked the passage of time except repetition. Years accumulated without weight. Huxley understood that memory requires friction. Moments become memorable because they resist, because they cost something to survive. In this world, survival was never in question. So memory thinned. Identity softened. The self became something that functioned rather than something that formed. This was not presented as tragedy. It was presented as outcome. A society that solved too many problems too early would eventually run out of people capable of asking why those problems mattered in the first place. This realization sits quietly at the center of the chapter, unresolved, waiting. Part C will move closer to the emotional edge of this world, where the first cracks appear, not as rebellion, but as confusion. The earliest signs of strain in this world did not look like resistance. They looked like confusion. People did not protest. They did not rebel. They did not articulate dissatisfaction in language that the system recognized as meaningful. Instead, they experienced moments that felt oddly unplaceable. A restlessness without object. A heaviness without cause. These moments passed quickly. They were treated, smoothed, redirected. But their recurrence mattered. Huxley imagined individuals who sensed that something was incomplete, yet lacked the framework to pursue that feeling. The system around them responded efficiently, offering explanations that closed inquiry rather than opened it. Fatigue was addressed. Anxiety was managed. Discomfort was labeled and relieved. What remained untouched was the question of why such feelings arose at all. Over time, people learned not to follow these signals. They learned to distrust interior states that did not yield immediate solutions. Curiosity without application felt indulgent. Reflection without outcome felt wasteful. This trained a particular kind of silence, not the silence of suppression, but the silence of unimportance. Certain thoughts simply failed to develop because there was nowhere for them to go. Huxley understood that meaning requires resistance. It forms when something pushes back long enough to be examined. In a world where friction dissolved quickly, meaning struggled to take shape. The people living inside this society were not shallow by choice. They were shaped by conditions that rewarded smoothness over depth, adjustment over interpretation. Their inner lives were functional, not expansive. This distinction mattered. Without depth, emotion became fleeting. Joy arrived easily and left quickly. Sadness was brief and resolved. Nothing settled long enough to transform. Life became a sequence of well-managed states rather than a process of becoming. Huxley did not portray this as despair. He portrayed it as stability taken to its logical extreme, a stability so complete that nothing disrupted it. In such a world, the self no longer needed to struggle to exist. Identity was supplied early, reinforced often, and rarely challenged. People knew who they were because the system told them, gently and repeatedly. This removed the burden of self-construction. It also removed the possibility of self-discovery. Discovery requires uncertainty. It requires failure. It requires time spent not knowing what one is supposed to become. Those conditions were increasingly rare. The imagined society did not forbid them. It made them unnecessary. What unsettled Huxley was how easily this could be mistaken for progress. A world that eliminated suffering without eliminating life would appear humane. A society that prevented pain without demanding sacrifice would seem compassionate. And yet compassion, when divorced from encounter, becomes administration. Care becomes policy. Relief becomes routine. The system did not ask its people to believe anything. It asked only that they continue participating in what worked. Participation reproduced the conditions that made alternatives feel irrelevant. This was the quiet closure of possibility. Not through denial, but through replacement. By the time someone sensed that something essential had been lost, there was no shared language to name it. And without shared language, recognition remained private. Private recognition does not travel far. Huxley understood that such a world would not announce its own limits. It would not collapse dramatically. It would persist, refining itself, smoothing its edges, reducing variation further. The danger was not that people would suffer. The danger was that they would forget what suffering once made possible. Aldous Huxley did not close this chapter with a warning. He closed it with a condition already in motion, a world functioning too well to notice what it no longer produces. What Huxley understood next was that a world like this could not be opposed from the outside. There was no clear edge to push against, no single institution to confront, no doctrine to dismantle. The system functioned through participation so ordinary that resistance felt theatrical. So he introduced a problem that could not be managed away, not a rebellion, not an ideology. A person. Huxley's imagined world required individuals who were adjusted enough to function, but different enough to reveal the limits of that adjustment. Someone shaped by the system, yet unable to settle fully into it. Someone whose discomfort could not be immediately labeled or relieved. This figure mattered because the system did not know how to speak to him. Everyone else moved smoothly through the routines that defined life. They accepted the language they were given. They understood the incentives. They felt the reassurance embedded in every structure. Their lives made sense inside the rules they had inherited. But there had to be someone for whom the rules did not resolve experience. Huxley did not make this figure heroic. That would have been dishonest. Heroism requires clarity. It requires a belief that something specific must be opposed. This person had no such belief. He was restless without knowing why, drawn toward ideas that no longer fit anywhere. He felt attraction to things the system treated as unnecessary, even inefficient. Books that were not useful, emotions that were not productive, questions that did not lead to solutions. The system could tolerate eccentricity. What it could not tolerate was unprocessed depth. Huxley designed this character to expose the gap between stability and meaning, not through speeches, but through friction, through moments where the world's solutions arrived too early, too smoothly, erasing something before it could become understood. This was the danger of a system that responded instantly. It left no space for interior struggle to mature into insight. The presence of such a person did not disrupt society immediately. That was important. If one individual could undo the system, it would be fragile. Huxley's world was not fragile. Instead, the individual experienced himself as the problem. His dissatisfaction felt personal. His inability to settle felt like a defect. He could see that everyone else seemed content, that their lives flowed without resistance, that they did not linger over questions he could not let go. This isolation was quiet. No one accused him. No one punished him. No one even argued with him. The system offered him relief. If he felt uneasy, there were ways to feel better. If he felt out of place, there were explanations that reassured him it was temporary. If he felt drawn toward intensity, there were safer substitutes. All of this was done gently, and that gentleness made refusal difficult. Huxley understood that the most revealing conflicts are not those imposed from above, but those that arise when a person cannot fully accept what is being offered. Aldous Huxley used this figure not to dramatize rebellion, but to show what happens when the system encounters something it cannot quite absorb. The system did not confront him. It studied him quietly, the way it studied everything that did not settle on its own. There were procedures for this, not punitive ones, supportive ones, adjustments calibrated to return people to equilibrium without making a spectacle of the effort. The system did not interpret his discomfort as resistance. It interpreted it as imbalance. So, It offered balance. If he lingered too long on questions without answers, there were activities designed to redirect attention. If he withdrew, there were structured forms of engagement that restored routine. If he spoke about feelings that had no clear source, those feelings were translated into terms the system could recognize and manage. Nothing he experienced was denied. Nothing was allowed to deepen. This was the subtlety of the response. The world did not argue with him. It agreed, then moved him gently past whatever he was trying to hold on to. Relief arrived, before reflection had time to take shape. At first, this felt like care. The system listened. It adjusted. It anticipated his needs more quickly than he could articulate them. There was comfort in that responsiveness. A sense of being seen, even if what was being seen felt incomplete. But over time, he began to notice that every intervention shortened something. Moments of intensity faded quickly. Curiosity dissolved into distraction. Feelings that might have grown into insight were softened into manageable states. He could not point to anything specific that had been taken from him. That made protest impossible. You cannot defend what you cannot name. Everyone around him seemed relieved by the same processes that unsettled him. They accepted the system's explanations easily. They trusted its remedies. Their ease made his unease feel disproportionate, even indulgent. So he began to doubt himself. Perhaps he was the one failing to adapt. Perhaps his discomfort was unnecessary, a residue of habits no longer required. The system encouraged this interpretation gently, offering reassurance rather than correction. Adjustment became the goal. The more he adjusted, the more functional he appeared, and the more functional he appeared, the less anyone saw reason to question the conditions shaping him. This was the paradox Huxley wanted to expose. A system that measures success by smoothness will always interpret friction as error. It will resolve the symptom without ever considering the signal. And because the resolution works, the system feels justified. Nothing in this process felt violent. It felt reasonable. The individual's inner life did not collapse. It thinned. It lost weight. Experiences still occurred, but they no longer accumulated. Each one was processed, resolved, and cleared away. Time passed without marking him. This was the cost that could not be explained inside the system, because the system had no category for it. It had solved for stability, not for depth. It had optimized for function, not for becoming. And so the encounter continued, not as a confrontation, but as a quiet negotiation between a person who felt too much and a world designed to make feeling manageable. Eventually, the system's responses stopped feeling helpful, not because they failed, but because they worked too well. Each time discomfort surfaced, it was resolved quickly enough that nothing could be learned from it. The relief arrived before understanding. The explanation arrived before the question finished forming. What remained afterward was a faint sense of something interrupted. He began to notice gaps, not absences that could be named, but moments that ended too cleanly, conversations that closed before reaching depth, emotions that were redirected before they could mature, curiosity that dissolved into stimulation without ever becoming insight. The world around him continued to function smoothly. Nothing outward had changed. People remained calm. Life remained organized. Satisfaction remained available on demand. Only his internal sense of continuity had begun to fracture. Experiences no longer connected to one another. Each moment stood alone, processed and cleared, leaving little residue. Memory lost its weight. Time moved forward, but without accumulation. He tried, briefly, to accept this as maturity. Perhaps this was what adulthood meant now. Efficiency of feeling. Emotional regulation without excess. Stability without turbulence. The system offered that interpretation readily. But something resisted. He could not articulate what it was, only that the ease he was being offered felt thin, not wrong, not cruel, insufficient. The more he adjusted, the more he sensed that adjustment itself had become the purpose. Life was no longer something to be wrestled with or shaped. It was something to be maintained within acceptable ranges. Maintenance replaced becoming. This realization did not arrive as rebellion. It arrived as fatigue. A tiredness that could not be wrested away, a weariness that no solution addressed, because it was not a malfunction. It was a response to the absence of friction. The system had no language for this. It offered comfort. It offered reassurance. It offered stability. What it could not offer was permission to remain unresolved. He began to understand that the unease he felt was not a personal failure, but a mismatch, a tension between a human capacity for depth and a world optimized to prevent depth from forming. This understanding did not free him. It isolated him. There was no shared vocabulary for what he sensed. Others experienced the same smoothing and found it sufficient. Their acceptance made his resistance feel unnecessary, even selfish. So the conflict remained internal, quiet, unacknowledged, contained. Huxley did not allow this tension to explode. That would have been dishonest. A world designed to absorb discomfort would not suddenly produce dramatic rupture. Instead, the tension settled into persistence, a low-grade dissatisfaction that could not be eliminated without eliminating something else along with it. This was the limit of accommodation, not collapse, not revolt, recognition. Recognition that something essential required difficulty in order to exist. That meaning did not emerge from ease alone. That a life without resistance might be manageable, but it would never be fully inhabited. Aldous Huxley closed this movement not with resolution, but with exposure, a system that could manage everything except the one thing it did not know how to value, and a person who could not fully belong to a world that functioned perfectly, but asked him to leave part of himself behind. What Huxley needed next was contrast sharp enough to be felt, not argument, not warning. Comparison. A world that functions perfectly cannot be understood from within alone. Its limits become visible only when placed beside something that does not fit. So he introduced a counterweight, not as an ideal, but as a remainder. This other way of being did not belong to the system he had constructed. It came from outside its logic, outside its expectations. It carried habits formed under conditions the system no longer recognized as useful. The contrast mattered because it was not symbolic. It was experiential. The person shaped by hardship did not move smoothly. He carried memory that did not resolve quickly. His emotions did not arrive pre-processed. His reactions were uneven, sometimes excessive, sometimes delayed. This made him inefficient. It also made him real. Huxley understood that the system would not perceive this as richness. It would perceive it as instability. Unpredictability disrupts coordination. Intensity complicates management. Depth resists standardization. So the system responded with patience. It offered to teach him better habits, to remove unnecessary tension, to help him adjust to a world that no longer required endurance. The offer was sincere. From the system's perspective, it was helping. But help arrived with a condition. To belong, he would need to relinquish parts of himself that no longer served a function. His memories would need to soften. His attachments would need to loosen. His sense of meaning would need to become less demanding. What the system could not understand was that these traits were not burdens. They were the residue of living. Huxley did not frame this contrast as purity versus corruption. That would have been too simple. The system offered real benefits: health, stability, relief from suffering that had once destroyed lives. The outside figure carried scars the system had successfully eliminated. And yet those scars held something the system could not reproduce. They anchored experience. Pain remembered had shape. Loss endured had weight. Choices made under pressure left marks that did not fade easily. These marks organized the self over time. They created continuity. In the system's world, continuity was managed externally. Identity was supplied. Memory was edited. Experience was curated to prevent accumulation. This was efficient. It was also thin. The contrast did not produce immediate conflict. It produced misunderstanding. The system interpreted the outsider's depth as pathology. The outsider interpreted the system's calm as emptiness. Neither could fully explain themselves to the other. Language failed first. The words available inside the system could not carry the outsider's experience. They translated it into stress, imbalance, maladjustment, something to be resolved rather than understood. The outsider sensed this translation as loss. Each attempt to communicate flattened what he was trying to express. The system responded to the surface and missed the substance. This was not hostility. It was incompatibility. Aldous Huxley used this contrast to make something visible that argument could not. A world optimized for comfort cannot easily receive a person shaped by difficulty. And in trying to help him belong, it risks erasing the very qualities that make his presence meaningful. The system did not reject him. That was the mistake an older kind of authority would have made. Rejection clarifies boundaries. It creates opposition. The world Huxley was describing did neither. It invited him in. Normalization began as accommodation. His differences were acknowledged, even respected, but only as temporary conditions. The assumption was that, given enough exposure to stability, his rough edges would smooth themselves. If he reacted intensely, he was told this would pass. If he lingered on memory, he was encouraged to focus forward. If he resisted simplification, he was reminded that ease was not weakness. The system did not say he was wrong. It said he was early. This framing was powerful. It positioned the world as patient and the individual as unfinished. Time would do the work. Adjustment would arrive naturally. At first, he tried. He learned the rhythms. He followed the routines. He accepted the explanations offered to him. He allowed his emotions to be translated into terms that fit the system's vocabulary. This translation worked. His intensity softened. His reactions became more predictable. His memories lost urgency. Life became easier to manage. Everyone around him saw this as success. The system responded positively. It reduced intervention. It increased trust. It treated him as increasingly integrated. Only one thing failed to improve. His sense of self did not deepen. It flattened. The parts of him shaped by hardship did not transform. They dissolved. The stories he carried no longer had a place to land. There was no resistance against which they could take shape. Without friction, meaning leaked away. Huxley was careful here. He did not portray this as violence. Nothing was taken forcibly. Everything was surrendered willingly, in exchange for belonging. The system never demanded abandonment. It simply made retention inconvenient. Holding on to intensity slowed interaction. Holding on to memory complicated explanation. Holding on to grief required time no one else seemed to have. So, he let go. Each letting go felt reasonable. Each adjustment felt small. None of them felt decisive. That was the danger. The system did not erase him. It normalized him. And normalization, once complete, left little behind to recognize what had been lost. From the outside, the transformation appeared successful. He functioned. He participated. He no longer disrupted the smooth movement of daily life. From the inside, something essential had thinned beyond recovery. The contrast Huxley wanted to expose was now fully visible. A system designed to eliminate suffering cannot easily distinguish between pain that wounds and pain that forms. In removing both, it produces people who are easier to manage but harder to become. The outsider did not revolt. He adapted, and adaptation, in this world, was the most complete form of surrender. Aldous Huxley used this moment not to dramatize loss, but to let it settle quietly. Belonging arrived gradually. There was no moment when the outsider crossed a visible threshold. No ceremony marking acceptance. The change revealed itself only in retrospect, when the effort of adjustment faded and routine took over. He was no longer watched. The system stopped correcting him because there was nothing left to correct. His responses fit. His pace matched. His reactions no longer slowed the room. From the outside, this looked like success. From the inside, it felt like quiet disappearance. The parts of him that had resisted normalization were not destroyed. They were rendered unusable. There was no place to express them where they would not be translated into something else. No context where their weight could be carried without explanation. So they remained unspoken. Over time, even silence became unnecessary. The habits of the system filled the space where reflection might have occurred. Activity replaced contemplation. Engagement replaced memory. He no longer felt conflicted. That was the clearest sign. The absence of conflict was not relief. It was emptiness, mistaken for calm. The system interpreted this calm as health. Those around him responded with approval. He was settled. He was integrated. He was no longer difficult to place. Only occasionally did a sensation surface that did not fit. A faint disorientation. A sense of having arrived somewhere without remembering the journey. A suspicion that something had been traded without a record of the exchange. These moments passed quickly. There were tools for that. The system excelled at preventing such sensations from accumulating. They were addressed before they could form questions. Relief arrived before recognition. This was the final efficiency. Huxley understood that what had been lost could not be recovered through opposition. There was nothing to oppose. The process had no clear antagonist. It offered comfort at every step and asked for nothing explicitly in return. The cost had been internal, a capacity for depth that required friction to survive, a sense of continuity built from memory that did not resolve cleanly, a self shaped by resistance rather than adjustment. Once those capacities thinned, there was no mechanism to rebuild them. The system had no use for them, and what has no use gradually disappears. The individual did not suffer dramatically. He lived well. That was the most unsettling outcome. A world capable of absorbing difference without violence, of dissolving intensity without force, of achieving harmony by narrowing what counts as human. Aldous Huxley placed this resolution deliberately, not as a warning of what would happen if people were cruel, but as a demonstration of what happens when systems succeed too completely. What followed was not rebellion, but normalization taken for granted. Once the system had finished shaping its people, it no longer needed to intervene actively. Its work was largely complete. The habits it had installed now sustained themselves. Participation flowed without effort. Adjustment no longer felt like adjustment. The world continued. This was the quiet outcome Huxley lingered on. Not catastrophe. Not awakening. Continuity. The people who lived inside this society did not experience themselves as diminished. They experienced themselves as functional. Life made sense. Expectations were clear. Emotions arrived within manageable ranges. Nothing demanded more from them than they were prepared to give. They did not miss what they had never been allowed to develop. This was the deepest difference between loss and absence. Loss produces grief. Absence produces nothing at all. Huxley understood that the most complete forms of control are invisible, not because they hide, but because they never introduce a contrast. If no alternative way of being is encountered, no comparison arises. Without comparison, judgment fades. So the system protected itself by narrowing exposure. History was present, but softened. Its conflicts were smoothed into narratives of progress. Pain was acknowledged briefly, then resolved. Suffering was treated as a stage already passed through, not as something that might still teach. Memory, like everything else, was curated. What remained were stories without friction, lessons without cost, examples without danger. This made the past safe. It also made it inert. The present felt permanent as a result. Without a past that resisted interpretation, the future no longer felt open. It arrived as continuation rather than possibility. People planned within boundaries rather than beyond them. Aspiration existed, but it was modest. Improvement meant refinement, not transformation. Huxley noticed how language reflected this closure. Words that once carried weight now described processes. Concepts that had once demanded struggle were treated as settled. Nothing felt unfinished. Even dissatisfaction had been reclassified. It was no longer a prompt for inquiry, but an indicator of imbalance, something to be corrected rather than examined. In such a world, reflection became rare not because it was discouraged, but because it felt unnecessary. The system worked. Why linger? The absence of pause became self-reinforcing. Without pauses, nothing accumulated. Without accumulation, there was nothing to reflect on. Life became a sequence of moments that passed cleanly, leaving no residue. Aldous Huxley did not describe this as emptiness. Emptiness would have implied awareness. He described it as completion, a society that had solved for stability so thoroughly that it no longer generated the conditions required for change. Even in a world shaped so completely by ease, something faint persisted, not as opposition, not as critique, as remainder. It appeared in moments that could not be optimized away entirely, in pauses that arrived unexpectedly, in sensations that slipped through before being named. A quiet unease that did not announce itself as dissatisfaction, only as absence. Most people ignored it. The system had trained them well. If something could not be resolved, it was bypassed. If a feeling did not fit, it was softened until it did. Attention moved forward, toward what worked, but occasionally a person lingered. Not long enough to disrupt anything, just long enough to notice a gap between experience and explanation, a sense that life moved smoothly, yet did not deepen. These moments were brief. They left no record. They were not shared. Without shared language, they remained private and easily dismissed. Huxley understood that survival in such a world did not require awareness. It required compatibility. Those who fit moved effortlessly. Those who did not were adjusted until they did. And yet, complete adjustment was rare. Some residue always remained. It showed itself in art that did not quite soothe, in stories that refused tidy endings, in memories that resurfaced without clear purpose, in attachments that lingered beyond their usefulness. These were not celebrated. They were tolerated. The system did not suppress them aggressively. It simply provided alternatives that were easier to accept. Over time, the alternatives won. Still, the remainder mattered. It reminded Huxley that human capacities do not disappear simply because they are inconvenient. They recede. They go dormant. They wait for conditions in which they might be required again. This was not hope in the usual sense. Hope implies expectation. This was persistence without promise. The people who felt these remnants did not gather. They did not recognize one another. They did not organize. The system ensured that isolation remained gentle and complete. Each person interpreted their unease as personal. This personalization was crucial. Shared discomfort becomes question. Private discomfort becomes mood. And moods pass. The system relied on this passing. It trusted time to smooth what it could not immediately resolve. Most of the time, it was right. Huxley did not claim that something dramatic would follow. He resisted prophecy. A world like this could continue indefinitely, refining itself, narrowing further, eliminating more friction with each iteration. The remainder was not a threat. It was a trace. A sign that something had once existed that no longer found a place. Whether that trace would ever matter depended on conditions the system had worked carefully to prevent. And so it remained quiet, uncollected, unspoken, untransmitted. Even in a world shaped so completely by ease, something faint persisted, not as opposition, not as critique, as remainder. It appeared in moments that could not be optimized away entirely, in pauses that arrived unexpectedly, in sensations that slipped through before being named. A quiet unease that did not announce itself as dissatisfaction, only as absence. Most people ignored it. The system had trained them well. If something could not be resolved, it was bypassed. If a feeling did not fit, it was softened until it did. Attention moved forward, toward what worked, but occasionally a person lingered, not long enough to disrupt anything, just long enough to notice a gap between experience and explanation, a sense that life moved smoothly, yet did not deepen. These moments were brief. They left no record. They were not shared. Without shared language, they remained private and easily dismissed. Huxley understood that survival in such a world did not require awareness. It required compatibility. Those who fit moved effortlessly. Those who did not were adjusted until they did. And yet, complete adjustment was rare. Some residue always remained. It showed itself in art that did not quite soothe, in stories that refused tidy endings, in memories that resurfaced without clear purpose, in attachments that lingered beyond their usefulness. These were not celebrated. They were tolerated. The system did not suppress them aggressively. It simply provided alternatives that were easier to accept. Over time, the alternatives won. Still, the remainder mattered. It reminded Huxley that human capacities do not disappear simply because they are inconvenient. They recede. They go dormant. They wait for conditions in which they might be required again. This was not hope in the usual sense. Hope implies expectation. This was persistence without promise. The people who felt these remnants did not gather. They did not recognize one another. They did not organize. The system ensured that isolation remained gentle and complete. Each person interpreted their unease as personal. This personalization was crucial. Shared discomfort becomes question. Private discomfort becomes mood, and moods pass. The system relied on this passing. It trusted time to smooth what it could not immediately resolve. Most of the time, it was right. Huxley did not claim that something dramatic would follow. He resisted prophecy. A world like this could continue indefinitely, refining itself, narrowing further, eliminating more friction with each iteration. The remainder was not a threat. It was a trace, a sign that something had once existed that no longer found a place. Whether that trace would ever matter depended on conditions the system had worked carefully to prevent. And so it remained quiet, uncollected, unspoken, untransmitted. The system mistook quiet for completion. Because nothing pushed back, it assumed nothing remained unmet. Because people complied easily, it concluded that compliance reflected satisfaction rather than adaptation. The absence of resistance was interpreted as proof that resistance was no longer necessary. Huxley saw the danger in this logic. Needs that are unmet but unrecognized do not disappear. They simply stop announcing themselves. When a society loses the ability to hear certain kinds of signals, it begins to confuse silence with health. The people living inside this world were not deprived. They were provided for. Their lives were orderly, their emotions regulated, their futures predictable. Nothing in their daily experience suggested urgency. And yet, urgency had not vanished. It had been displaced. Without a place to surface collectively, it settled inward. It became diffuse. It appeared as restlessness without direction, fatigue without cause, dissatisfaction without object. The system addressed these states efficiently. It offered balance. It offered reassurance. It offered distraction. Each intervention worked well enough to prevent accumulation. What it did not address was the underlying absence of friction that once gave those feelings meaning. Huxley understood that societies often fail, not by ignoring human needs, but by fulfilling the wrong ones too completely. Comfort answered quickly can drown out questions that require time to mature. Stability, once achieved, can become an argument against change. In such a world, necessity loses its voice. Change becomes optional. Optional things are easily postponed. Postponement stretches indefinitely when nothing forces a decision. The future, once a site of uncertainty and risk, becomes an extension of the present. Plans refine what already exists. Progress means optimization rather than transformation. This creates a peculiar stillness, not stagnation, not collapse. Continuation without tension. The system does not decay, it persists. It grows more precise. It removes inefficiencies with increasing confidence. Each refinement makes reversal less imaginable. The people shaped by it do not feel trapped. They feel settled. Settlement, however, is not the same as fulfillment. Aldous Huxley did not suggest that this world would implode under its own weight. He suggested something quieter, that it would endure long enough for people to forget that endurance itself was once a skill, that the absence of resistance would be mistaken for the absence of need, that a society could become so effective at maintaining equilibrium that it would lose the capacity to recognize what equilibrium had replaced. Huxley did not end by telling the reader what to do. That would have violated the logic of everything he had shown. A book that warned directly would become part of the same machinery it described. It would provoke defense. It would be classified, interpreted, and neutralized. So he ended elsewhere. He returned the burden quietly to the reader's interior life. The world he had constructed did not demand agreement. It did not require belief. It asked only one thing, implicitly, whether the reader recognized anything familiar in its smoothness. Not the institutions, not the technologies. The feeling, the sense of ease that arrives too quickly, the relief that closes questions before they deepen, the preference for comfort over uncertainty. Huxley trusted that recognition more than argument. Recognition does not need to persuade. It simply waits. Once seen, it cannot be unseen. This is why the book does not end with catastrophe. Catastrophe would offer distance. It would reassure the reader that danger always announces itself dramatically. That collapse arrives with noise. Huxley had already shown otherwise. The real danger, if it could be called that, was quiet continuation. A future that feels reasonable at every step. A present that functions so efficiently, it never pauses long enough to be examined. He understood that people rarely choose what harms them directly. They choose what feels easier now, what reduces friction, what allows them to move forward without hesitation. Over time, those choices accumulate into structures, no one consciously designed. Responsibility dissolves, not because no one cares, but because caring has been replaced by management. Care becomes procedural. Relief becomes routine. Discomfort becomes error. None of this feels violent. That is what makes it persuasive. Huxley did not accuse the reader of complicity. accusation would close the book too neatly. Instead, he left the reader with a question that has no clear answer. What does it mean to live a human life when the conditions that once shaped it have been optimized away? He did not define humanity narrowly. He did not romanticize suffering. He did not claim that pain was noble or that progress was a mistake. He asked something more unsettling. What happens when a society becomes so effective at removing difficulty that it no longer knows what difficulty was for? The book closes not by resolving this question, but by allowing it to remain open, uncomfortable, unfinished, patient. Huxley understood that the future does not arrive as a rupture. It arrives as habit. People do not wake one morning inside a new world. They wake inside yesterday, slightly refined. The changes are small enough to accept, useful enough to welcome, and familiar enough to defend. Nothing feels imposed. Everything feels earned. This is why he refused to offer conclusions. A conclusion would suggest that the matter was settled. That recognition completed the task. But recognition is only a beginning, and even that beginning is fragile. What he offered instead was a way of noticing how often relief replaces reflection, how often solutions arrive before questions finish forming, how often ease is mistaken for wisdom. These are not political failures. They are human tendencies. They arise wherever systems grow capable enough to anticipate desire and remove friction. They do not require cruelty. They do not require conspiracy. They require only preference. Aldous Huxley trusted the reader to carry this noticing forward without being told how to use it. He knew that instruction invites compliance, and compliance was the very condition he had spent the book examining. So the responsibility he leaves behind is quiet. It does not demand resistance. It does not demand sacrifice. It does not demand certainty. It asks for attention. Attention to moments when comfort feels too complete, when stability begins to substitute for meaning, when the absence of difficulty is taken as evidence that nothing important is being avoided. He did not argue that suffering should be preserved. He argued that its removal has consequences that cannot be optimized away. Some capacities only develop under strain. Some forms of understanding require time spent with discomfort that cannot be resolved immediately. Some questions lose their force when answered too quickly. The danger he traced was not that societies would become cruel. It was that they would become efficient at eliminating the very conditions that produce depth, resilience, and moral imagination. This is not a warning shouted into the future. It is an observation offered to the present, a reminder that what feels humane in the short term can quietly reshape what it means to be human over time. Huxley closes by leaving the reader where he began, inside their own preferences, inside the small, ordinary choices that feel reasonable in isolation and irreversible in accumulation. The book ends without urgency. Because urgency can be postponed, what it leaves behind is something slower. A question that does not demand an answer, but refuses to disappear. And the knowledge that what is easiest to live with today may be the hardest thing to recover tomorrow.